Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us here today. Tomorrow is the anniversary of the Aquifer Breach at Clearwater. So we thought this would be a good time to update everyone about what we're seeing both on the ground and what we're not seeing in terms of information that's being shared with us, and so that we can have a full picture of the damage that is continuing and being uncovered. I'm Sarah Wolf. I'm the Advocacy Director with the Minnesota Environmental Partnership. And we're hosting this today as an opportunity for you to hear from two experts in these categories. Jeff Broberg is a Minnesota licensed professional geologist with over 30 years of groundwater experience in Minnesota. And Dr. Christy Dolph is a PhD research scientist studying the connections between land, climate, water, and the health of aquatic life. And she's also the co-founder of Science for the People, Twin Cities. This webinar is being recorded. And I'm just going to turn it over to Jeff. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. And I think people can post questions in the chat and we'll address those after our presentations are done. So today I want to tell you a story about the patterns of misrepresenting the risk of violating permits and covering up environmental damage that we've seen while we're investigating a number of events on the sites along the pipeline route. I want to share some breaking news though, and we just heard this morning. Enbridge apparently has notified the DNR that the Clearbrook Aquifer Breach was stopped on January 18th. To us, it's amazing if true. We want proof that 30 days after the water level has been restored, that there's no other evidence of groundwater upwelling in this area. That's in their restoration order. And we want all of the other aquifer ruptures and frackouts addressed. We have 28 frackouts, 2 other potential aquifer breaches. And we've been watching from the air drone videos, and we saw last week that Enbridge had a drill rig and they were grouting up the spring. This guy that I'm pointing at was slamming his shovel on the top of this to see if that concrete had set up. So this is the effort that they're claiming has sealed the aquifer. The requirement is that they prove it within 30 days of not having the water come back to the surface. What I really want to talk about and put in context is what it means to have a year anniversary of an aquifer breach like this. One of their first operations in January 21st of 2021, they dug down below the scheduled depth for construction, too close to an aquifer, an artesian aquifer, and it blew out and caused a quicksand pit. That was a year ago. Yet by the end of March, they had finished, they had dewatered the aquifer, put in a trench pile system, put in their pipe and finished their pipeline connection, still leaving the aquifer breach unaddressed through April, May. The DNR finally got involved in June and demanded some plans on what they were going to do with this. July, August. Finally in August, the DNR wrote a restoration order, detailed the history and told them what they were going to have to do. By then, the pipeline construction was almost complete, and on August 1st, the oil started to flow through the pipeline. I've been involved since then, and we've been dealing with a large group of people, Senator Marty, some other scientists and citizens and tribal members, and we've been making queries to the state agencies throughout October, November, December, and haven't gotten any questions. In January, finally, they're saying the aquifer is fixed. We're looking at the anniversary, but they have until then to prove it. So we want to bear in mind the long history of this. A lot of this is about what happens on the landscape. We have a whole water dependent system here. The rupture occurred in this area just to the west side of the Clearbrook terminal. The DNR has expressed concern and has monitoring sites all through it, like calcareous fens, upwelling groundwater that occurs in this glacial escarpment that runs all across the landscape. This is one of the major questions, is the groundwater release affecting those fens? We've had a year of uncontrolled flow. This is what it looked like 2 days after the excavation. It totally turned the excavation site into quicksand. There was no operating there. They knew this was a big problem. It was an alarming issue that required a change in plans that included a sheet pile trench. These sheet piles were driven down 30 feet so that they could dewater this area with pumps down to an 18-foot level, dig this out and get the pipe installed. That's what they spent their next few days doing. And by the middle of March, that operation of putting the pipe in place was complete. But the aquifer was still damaged. When the pumps were turned off, the water started rushing to the surface. These are pictures from July of the water that's just freely flowing from the surface. This is the throat of the spring where this water is upwelling. There's another one all the way back in this corner from removing the trench piles, the pilings in the trench. And the water was flowing freely. They won't even tell us the rates that the water was flowing out of here. We don't understand yet what the volume was. All the while this was going on, other operations, high directional drilling operations, were occurring underneath 23 rivers, 23 or 28 river crossings. And they were realizing frackouts. And we're concerned about this, they call them inadvertent loss of drilling mud into the groundwater. And we're concerned that they aren't really addressing the potential impact from these frackouts. Here's a piece of a technical paper on evaluating frackouts from the U.S. Corps of Engineers, explaining how these work. As you're boring a pipe in, you would have a standard volume of material that is lost, and hopefully your boring stays in gauge. It's not very much bigger than the pipe. But as frackouts occur, the top of this caves in, or it washes out from the hydraulic pressure, and you're constantly pumping mud, and that cavity gets bigger and bigger with this loose slurry of material that's been disturbed by the drilling until it finally fracks out at the surface. The problem is that Enbridge and the state agencies have only been addressing the surface. It's a significant problem. On the left-hand side here, you can see some pictures from the Indigenous Environmental Network, drone pictures of frackouts at the Mississippi River crossing. A large frackout. Here they have their own sheet pile system to make the bridge over the river. This is where the mud came to the surface. You can see here, this round thing, we believe that's a frackout from the Mincan pipeline, where that cavity collapsed, and there's a lower ground level in here as the mud continued to come to the surface. And we're concerned that this is continuing to go on. Here's a picture, an aerial picture that we believe this trench, the removal of this trench, had also created a frackout. We believe this is drilling mud coming back to the surface just 2 months ago in November, many months after all of this construction was thought to be complete, and Enbridge was claiming that they had done a great job. They've been misrepresenting the risk since 2020. If you go back in the 401 permit applications, the summary of hydrofracture analysis and horizontal drilling, a 300-page report where they hired engineers to assess the risk of inadvertent mud loss. They concluded that the risk was low, and they never disclosed how much mud they would expect to lose. It's interesting, in that report, the engineers that were hired, JD Engineers, wrote, the risk of inadvertent returns due to hydrofracture is low over the majority of the crossing lengths. This was the statement they made and signed as engineers in all but one of the river crossings. And yet in the same report, they showed that a dozen river crossings had had a history of frackouts with earlier pipelines. The data in the geotechnical report cited all of the reasons for the risk that would occur: gravelly beds, sandy beds, overpressured beds that had hydraulic flows or artesian flows. And those were in the geotechnical reports. And that the way the engineers handled this was to do a model analysis where they took the stratigraphy and assigned risk values to these earth materials, and they averaged the risk over all of the high risk and low risk beds that were found in the borings. A classic way to conceal the real issues. And these analyses should best be done using the highest risk factors so that you could understand. And the conclusion in the 401 permits might have been a lot different. If this were cited as a high risk, someone might have asked the question, well, what's happening to all the mud? The inadvertent flow, you're only cleaning up, planning to clean up a few hundred gallons on the surface, but there's a lot more. Well, the narrative just changed. In a series of correspondence between Senator Marty, PCA, and Enbridge, Senator Marty asked the PCA to get the mud drilling data. They said they couldn't get it from Enbridge. Could he help try to get the data? The letter he sent on January 7th asked for that data, and Enbridge replied that said, no, they're not going to give that to us. They're not required to. It's not part of the permits. And they made a statement that was contrary to their engineers. They said the inadvertent release of drilling fluid during HDD crossings is a generally known and common risk associated with these methods. That is exactly the opposite impression that they gave during the permitting. So why are we trusting people that make these kinds of misrepresentations? If you review the Enbridge plans for inadvertent release response, a 100-page report, the word groundwater does not even occur in their report. You can do a search, you can see. They aren't concerned about the groundwater. They're trying to cover up the impacts that these drilling fluids would have to our groundwater. We know there's some risk. They're high pH materials. They use sodium ash to mix with the mud as a minimum component of additives. There's other additives that we don't know how they break down. We don't know if you could drink the water next to these sites or not in these shallow aquifers. We're asking questions of everybody, and they say they're environmental stewards, but they won't give us answers of whether our groundwater and our drinking water is safe. Now, January 2022, they've designed an aquifer fix. This is pictures from a week and a half ago. On the left-hand side, these are the big sheds that had the pumps that were drawing the water down to get the water level down 30 feet below the surface. These are pictures of the site where they're discharging the water into ponds and letting it go out into a wetland off the site. And here's a picture of the drill rig and the operators pumping cement into that spring that they're now claiming is solving this problem. We need to fix the aquifer. We're hoping it's true that this aquifer is sealed, but we need to fix the process. We have had people, and you'll hear from Christy Dolph next, who have been dealing with this from the permitting process and raising these risks and being told all the time, oh, the engineers assure us these are low risks. If there's any problem, there will be accountability. It's now time to have that accountability. We need to do things. We're doing more. We're demanding the data on the misrepresentations, the violations, and the cover-ups from the agencies. Sharing this with the Attorney General, trying to deal with how did this break down? We haven't been able to address our groundwater. The tribes are conducting their own high-definition thermal sensing of the entire line to see where there's other breaches, where there's new groundwater coming to the surface. Are these frackouts continuing to cause a problem for us? The citizen science, water quality monitoring is ongoing at the sites. We have people that are equipping themselves now to do that. So what do we want? We want forensic engineering by knowledgeable people to investigate Coldbrook and the other two aquifer breaches and frackouts. We want the agencies to move forward and prove our waters are safe and not act as a shield for Enbridge. What should you do? Speak out, ask your agencies to protect the water. There's 2 gatherings tomorrow, ceremonies about the year anniversary. There's a gathering at the St. Paul DNR headquarters at 11 a.m. With a press conference. There's a solemn ceremony tomorrow at the Clearbrook Terminal at 1 p.m. These details can be found on Honor the Earth's website. Call the governor and ask him to make the agencies address the safety of our water. Thank you. I'm going to turn it over to Christy. Muted.
Thank you. Cool. So I'm going to just share my screen here and sort of build on some of what Jeff said. And let's see if I can get this to share here. Okay, cool. Great. So, you know, like Jeff has mentioned, there's numerous things that we've been concerned about that folks on the ground have observed really since the beginning of construction, that scientists have been involved in trying to document, that Ron Turney from Indigenous Environmental Network has been documenting with drone footage. And so what we wanted to do was really get a grip on what is the complete list of concerns that we know about to raise with the agencies that's happened during or after construction. And so what we did was we compiled a detailed list. It's 10 pages of bulleted points about degradation that we knew of, including the aquifer breaches that Jeff has mentioned, the frackouts. And this is a list that we brought to the agencies because we're really looking for accountability. You know, as Jeff mentioned, these permits ostensibly were granted under the idea that we're not going to see long-term impacts in many of these locations. And that really doesn't match what we're seeing on the ground. So we compiled this list. We shared it with the agencies, the commissioners. We asked for meetings to talk about what's being done, what kind of information can we get so we can understand the full impact at these sites. And as a result, we did have multiple meetings with both the commissioners of MPCA and DNR, as well as agency staff. And I think the frustrating aspect of this is that they're willing to listen, the agencies are willing to listen, but they do not disclose really any of the information that we're asking questions about. So it's really totally unclear to us what actions they may or may not be taking to work towards understanding what's going on at these sites, any kind of monitoring, what the accountability is for Enbridge now and going forward, what the restoration plans are. It's just, we don't know. And they've really been using this Data Practices Act. They talk about ongoing investigations, and so they can't share information with us. And what that really does is create a shield for Enbridge. Because now the public, those of us who are really concerned about this, have no way to know what needs to be done going forward. Meanwhile, Enbridge, of course, is continuing to ask for permits for new projects like Line 5, projects along the Gulf. And so it's really in their best interest to keep this information under wraps. And what's concerning is the role that the agencies are playing right now in facilitating that. Essentially, that cover up of what might be happening, that's the outcome. Whether or not that's the agency's intent, that's what we're seeing. So because we haven't been able to get a lot of information from the agencies, what we have done is try to figure out things ourselves. And this what you're seeing here is the outcome of some community-based sampling that Water Protectors did starting in the summer, but that's continuing on now through the winter. Looking at frackout locations, collecting water samples, trying to screen for contaminants or water quality degradation that might be a concern. It's difficult because we don't know the chemical composition of the drilling fluid. That's never been disclosed. So we're not working with a lot of prior information. But what I can say, this is from an analysis that we did of water quality samples that were collected at a number of sites by water protectors. There are enough flags in what we're seeing. So in some cases, we're seeing elevated suspended sediments, we're seeing elevated pH, we're seeing elevated sulfates. Those are enough flags to warrant increased monitoring going forward. They indicate that there could well be impacts from frackouts to water quality that have implications for aquatic life, that could have implications for things like wild rice, but there's no way for us to know unless somebody gets out there and does the amount of monitoring that it would take to be able to identify what's going on. So like I say, and Jeff mentioned this too, there's some really basic pieces of information that we would need to start to understand what the impact is at these sites. And this is information that we have asked the agencies repeatedly for. We've asked Enbridge for it. And it includes things like, where are the aquifer breaches? What is the extent of those? We've heard a little bit of news today about the Clearbrook aquifer, but that's one of multiple aquifers that occurred along the route. We also don't know things like the total volume of mud that entered the environment that may be in the subsurface that could represent an ongoing impact to water quality, groundwater, and surface water. And we also don't know what the process is for evaluating the risk of these fluids to water. So for example, we don't know if the agencies considered a scenario where thousands or millions of gallons would be released to the environment. Because as Jeff mentioned, the engineers said that's likely not going to happen. That's a low risk. So we don't know if the agencies even considered the situation that we have on the ground when they created this project. Something important to know here is we've been asking the agencies repeatedly to get their folks out on the ground to look at these sites, to do some independent investigation, because the monitoring of construction impacts that's occurring and that's in place it's by Enbridge. So it's Enbridge hired folks, consultants who are doing this monitoring and then reporting it to the agencies. And given the omissions, the misleading information in the permits, this is not a reassuring approach to us for accountability going forward. And as far as we know, Enbridge has no plans to monitor what's going on in the groundwater at these frackout locations at all. So we really need a higher level of investigation than what we have in place right now. Jeff mentioned this, so without any information from the agencies, we're kind of on our own in terms of trying to figure out what's going on. And something that I've been really inspired by is the ongoing investment by community members to understand the aftermath of this construction. So Jeff mentioned the tribes have invested in flying the entire route to understand disruptions to groundwater. Folks are looking at doing ongoing water sampling at frackout locations along the route to try and understand if there are long-term impacts. Because that was another condition of the permitting, is that most of the impacts were portrayed as temporary, maybe lasting a couple hours or a couple days. And so it's really important to look at, are we seeing long-term, months, years long potential impacts from things like drilling fluid spills. Okay, last thing I just want to end on here is these issues that we're talking about today are very relevant to, for example, Line 5, which is going through a permitting process right now. That's a similar environment that pipeline is proposed to go through. And so as that struggle moves forward, I think these issues are issues that need to be addressed. And my question is, what is going to change from the agencies? we can see how this process has failed. So how do we move towards accountability and transparency and protection? Like Jeff mentioned, I think things that you can do, it's really important for state leaders, the governor, the agencies to hear from you that we are still concerned about this. The reason we're concerned is because the environmental destruction is unresolved. It's ongoing. We don't even know the full extent of it. We can't get that information. And so I think demanding that accountability is really important. And then, of course, immediately, as Jeff mentioned, events tomorrow on the anniversary of the Aquifer Breach in St. Paul and Clearbrook. I'm going to stop there. I think we're going to do questions, but I'll turn it over to Sarah. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much for those presentations. I've been trying to track the questions that have been coming in on the chat, and I'll start there, and then I think we'll hopefully have continued time to field questions. So if you have a question, please put it in the chat. One of the first questions was about whether there were requirements to record the amount of mud used that came in. And we know that Enbridge did provide some kind of report about mud cleanup, drilling sludge cleanup back in August. So can you shed some light on, were they required to keep track of the amount of mud they were pumping into the ground?
Yeah, this is Jeff, and according to Enbridge, they say no, there was no requirement in those permits. We know it's a contract requirement. It's probably a pay item for the contracts, and it's something they do. We know that they, from past experience, my construction experience, they keep very close track of. They really obfuscated that issue. It's a question that should have been asked in the 401 permitting process. But they never mention how much mud they're going to lose. They mention the quality of the mud, the density of the mud, even the pH of the materials that go into the mud, but not the volumes, and focus totally on what they could recover at the surface. The disclosures that they made, it ranged from 5 gallons to, I think, 9,000 gallons was received at the surface. Our concern is, according to the Corps of Engineers' own models, that could equate to millions of gallons of mud in the subsurface.
I'll go on to the next question. I saw, yeah, one of the questions that came in early in the chat was, what does this say about the state's ability to review these permit requests? Does the state have the expertise to ask the questions that Jeff is asking?
I think both Christy and I can answer that. The short answer is that the concrete they put in the well won't restore the rupture of trust. They are claiming Data Practices Act that we don't think is appropriate about not talking about the safety of our groundwater. We think there needs to be changes in how these communications are made so that the public can have an actual assessment based on facts and don't spin our wheels just constantly asking questions that never get answered. It's very frustrating. Christy, you might want to take that on too.
Yeah, I guess what I would add is, something I'm sympathetic to is these agencies don't necessarily have a huge capacity. They don't have huge additional budgets. And so when these projects get permitted, the agency staff rely on the consultants, Enbridge's consultants, who do the assessment. That's really what they're working with. And, as Jeff has raised, I think that's very eye-opening, is if consultants are using practices to underplay the risk of these projects, that's sketchy. That's a huge issue. And of course, they're being paid by Enbridge, so that's who they're working for. So I think it's partly that the process is not very sound. I will say, though, that as scientists, and I saw somebody in the chat ask, like, who's we when we say we? So I've been part of a group of scientists who's been working on Line 3, the permit specifically, since 2019, 2020. And so we've had an interdisciplinary group of folks raising issues about pipeline construction. We submitted technical comments back in April of 2020 about the unsuitability of the geology of these regions for pipeline construction. We've raised these issues, related issues with the agencies for a long time. And so I think, what I've seen is that the agency doesn't have a great way to say no to these projects. They don't have a past, they've denied very few projects ever. And so in order to deal with this appropriately, they're gonna really have to break from the status quo of how these projects have been treated. I'm gonna stop there. I have a lot to say about it. But I do think there's some really profound structural problems with how the agencies are dealing with these projects.
I'd like to add something to this too, and it's come out of the correspondence we've had back and forth to the questions. Our group had queried about the independent environmental monitors, and with the knowledge that many of them had worked for Enbridge in the past, and we claimed whether that wasn't perhaps a conflict of interest. The commissioners of PCA and DNR wrote back and said, no, it wasn't a conflict of interest, that they hired these people to be guides on pipeline activities because their staff didn't know enough about it, that they were being helpful by having had that experience. So you really have to question, the authority we give people for permits without ever having had any experience, or without knowing mud loss is a major issue. Or without thinking about the fate and transport of millions of gallons of mud locked in our aquifers. Those are issues that the DNR MPCA weren't asking, probably because of their lack of experience with many of these types of construction issues. And then they were overwhelmed by a project that was supposed to take 2 years to construct, took 9 months. They had over 20 work sites working at any given time and getting hundreds of reports every day. It's a mammoth task that takes a dedicated full-time staff to deal with these kinds of permit issues in affecting our environment. We don't have that here in Minnesota.
Thank you. I'll shift to another question. Why aren't we monitoring the groundwater at all the HDD sites?
Indeed. We have a new Supreme Court ruling this year that said that we can't be putting things into the groundwater that don't meet the secondary drinking water standards, pH, sulfates, color, turbidity. And there's not been a mention of that among the agencies. And there has never been any request to monitor the groundwater, as if there was never a recognition that this is the standard effect of HDD drilling when you have frackouts. So we should be doing that. If I was a landowner, I would insist that it be done if you were coming in an easement through my land. And I think in those areas where it's on state land, the citizens of Minnesota have a right to know. And we ought to be out there monitoring the groundwater and see, is it drinkable? Even these shallow aquifers, there's many people, households that rely on shallow wells in these very shallow aquifers that have good water until you start injecting things into
them. Another question, did frackouts only occur at HDD sites, at the horizontal directional drilling sites?
Yes, the frackouts are a function of the use of drilling mud. We have another issue of aquifer breaches that occur along the same pipeline setting, sometimes like Clearbrook, where they were doing HDD. We don't know where the others were. We believe they were also HDD sites. But it is, the frackouts are a function of the use of drilling mud during the horizontal drilling.
And just the context, so there's 212 streams and rivers that were crossed by this project, as well as many wetlands. most of those crossings were done by a method called open trenching, where they're digging a trench across the system. Those have also issues that can cause long-term degradation. HDD was really billed as, oh, it's the safer method. So it's, it's going to result in less degradation. So we're going to use it at these, very high quality, high value river crossings. And that also turns out to be misleading, as Jeff showed that quote from Enbridge saying, oh no, frackouts are likely, we expect them, they happen all the time. And so the ostensible benefits of something like HDD are obviously, the ostensible benefits relative to open trenching are less if you are spilling millions of gallons of frac fluid into the environment. So just to have that context around, why they use that method and what they said about it, and then what is the actual outcome.
Right, and there are several questions kind of related to how we go forward here. One of them I'm seeing is, are there dollars from the infrastructure bill available to be used for these kinds of problems? And I wonder, Jeff, I know you've done some tracking about the dollar value of the oil going through the pipe at this point.
Right. It's hard to tell all the details of the infrastructure bill, and I think what Sarah was alluding to, we know the economics of this at a flow rate of 750,000 barrels a day. They're pumping over, depending on the price of oil, over $50 million a day worth of oil through the pipeline. $20 billion a year worth of product, and they're playing tiddlywinks with our water. So I think we need to be going after the cause and source of the problem, and that's why we've advocated that the agencies shut down the permits for the flow of the oil until all of these issues are fixed. We think that would be a bigger motivator than anything else. Infrastructure bill, we're not going to have a lot of details, I understand, till the fall. I don't know that there's anything in there for this type of environmental issue.
Yep. And so, yeah, just to say that, so Jeff, you said $50 million a day of product.
Yes.
And the fine that DNR, leveled at Enbridge for the aquifer breach, the one aquifer breach that we have details about, that was a $3 million fine. So it's really a drop in the bucket in terms of the profits that Enbridge is reaping on a daily basis.
And I'd like to make a slight correction to that. That $3 million is actually an escrow account to pay for the aquifer breach. It's not technically a fine, so they have the ability to recover that money once the aquifer breach is cleared. Well, they're really treating Enbridge with kid gloves and nothing close to the environmental or to the financial impact that would occur if they just said, no, you can't use the line until then.
We've received some questions about documents you've referred to. Can we get a copy of the list of failures and violations that you were referring to earlier on the presentation? The writer of that question said it needs to be shared with the Wisconsin DNR. And then a question about the letter you referred to from Enbridge that said that inadvertent releases are common during horizontal directional drilling. I think we should find a way of sharing that. Does that seem right?
Right.
Getting some links to those things.
I personally, or I'd ask that person to send me a personal message with their email and I'll send it to them. But we should figure out a process. We have a lot of correspondence going back till October that's revealing in the lack of information they share. And it's so frustrating.
So if you have need for those documents, be sure you're reaching out to one of us while we figure out a way to post it too.
Right. That's good. Thank you.
There are some questions about is there an avenue for a stronger permitting process? In a related question, someone says, should the state be implementing a moratorium on these kinds of projects until they can obtain more expertise And others are looking for like what legislatively might we do to ensure stronger permitting around this. Do you have any kinds of comments in those areas?
I mean, I think, so these are like big picture things about how to make this change happen. And I don't, as one person, have the answers to that. What I can say, just having worked on this permitting issue for now several years, I do think we have laws on the books now that would enable the agencies to deny permits for these projects. And I think doing that would be a break from the past, but that's what we're asking for. Business as usual and the status quo hasn't led to a great place in terms of obviously climate crisis or stewardship of wetlands over time. So I think we need to ask them to make a big change. There are actually pretty good laws on the books from the 1970s that would allow them to take stronger action. And I think it's a matter of the willingness to do that and to take to risk to break with the precedent in the past and the sort of way they have approached it previously. So that doesn't answer everything, but that's just something that I've thought about it and been, you know, struggling with ever since looking at this a lot more closely.
To me, this is one of the most important questions, because the state of Minnesota is going to be faced with more big projects, whether it's pipelines or mines, and we need to first make sure that the applicants' fees for these permits totally cover the cost of doing a review. Second, those reviews should be done by people that have experience. We need other independent engineering firms, groundwater experts, those people to be involved and not place the burden on a staff that might not have the experience with those sorts of things. And then we need to put those things into permit conditions, just like the groundwater impact. There's nothing that was overt in there about protecting the groundwater in any of this. So there's things we need to do, and it's such an important question. There's a political question to this because it may require some statutory guidance. But I think Christy's right. By and large, the elements are in place. And just a quick example, the PCA made a determination that the water impact rule did not need to be considered because there were temporary impacts. In the non-degradation, they waived the water non-degradation standards because there were going to be temporary impacts. And yet we see fracking mud, we believe, coming to the surface months after the pipeline's done. We don't know what the permanent impact of that mud locked in the aquifers are. It could be thousands of years, millions of years. We don't know. It's not coming out any other way. So we need to be more cognizant of those and not let them say, oh, it's temporary. When the construction's done, we're done.
Yeah, and just one other thing I thought about, because we're talking about permitting and this project has been permitted, but for example, DNR has issued the license for water crossings that covers construction and operation of the pipeline. So there's no reason they cannot revoke the license for operation based on the many unresolved issues that we're seeing. Should this pipeline continue to operate when the construction resulted in impacts that we don't know the extent of? And I think there's definitely a case to be made that the agencies need to use the tools at their disposal to demand accountability, because at the end of the day, their mission is to the public. It's to us. Their mission is not to protect Enbridge.
There's a question about, I think, the court case, the Supreme Court case you referred to earlier, Jeff. The question is, if the court has ruled on groundwater quality, can the PUC and MPCA be forced to comply?
I think they can. I think the Supreme Court ruling was related to leachate discharges that were impacting groundwater at a facility, and they clarified a number of loopholes that had been used in the past to avoid dealing with that. I think the February ruling is clear enough. We need some smart lawyers to look at that and see what we can do to protect our groundwater, knowing we now have clarity in groundwater being subject to secondary drinking water standards.
Mingin says multiple companies plan to build carbon capture pipelines in Minnesota, and some will use HDD at the Minnesota River and other waterways. Is the geology of west central and southwestern Minnesota also vulnerable to frackouts? Is there any reason to believe that MPCA and DNR will do a better job this time around?
Well, I can say with some certainty that they will cross areas that are vulnerable to frackouts. You're dealing always with a river system that was formed in a glacial process. So I can't think of, as a geologist, I can't think of any place in Minnesota where you would not encounter the variable soils, and in fact, the very coarse gravelly soils that create the biggest problem. So I think we need to, in the future, take a really close look at those engineering reports to make sure that they are actually assessing the risk and not averaging the risk so that they get their permits.
Thanks. I think that's there have been a few questions coming in about kinds of consequences, malpractice on engineers, any way to ensure that consultants might provide less biased reports.
Well, there's a couple answers to that. In the first instance, Enbridge ought to go to their engineers and say, you guys are causing us a lot of trouble. You could have disclosed that what the actual risks were, and there are liability consequences. If I was at Enbridge, that would be the first thing I'd do, is call the guy that signed those. Just to manage engineers and those that were preparing these kinds of permits, I jokingly told them that they were the designated felons. They were the ones that were making the statements to the public that their license relies on. So we brought this issue up to the Attorney General. We would hope that the PCA and DNR see the same thing and take actions in those regards. I think it is a very serious professional breach.
Yeah, agree with that. And just Jeff mentioned, we have, met with the Attorney General about this. I don't know. It's not clear to me what actions, if any, the Attorney General's office is taking. So again, we don't know. We don't know what kind of, if any, consequences are being considered at this point. But it's something that we've certainly raised with them. What is the ethical accountability for these environmental consultants on which this whole process is relying?
Thank you. There's a question about sulfate levels and wild rice relating to the April 2021 federal pollution regulators identifying water bodies in Minnesota that grow wild rice that have sulfate levels that exceed state limits. Wondering about the water quality standards and the process the PCA is going through, which is a whole nother issue, but also wondering if you're seeing in the samples you're taking any information on sulfates and how that relates to the 10 parts per million standard.
Yes, well, so I'll speak to that a little bit. I'll just say we have very little information. So we were able to collect a relatively modest number of, very, very modest, a small number of samples. at the Mississippi River headwaters, at a number of other locations where frackouts occurred. At the Mississippi headwaters, water protectors were also able to collect a sample of the drilling fluid itself from a wetland. And so we screened those samples for a variety of chemistry. We didn't know what we were going to find, but the drilling fluid itself contained some sulfates, a fair amount of sulfates. We also saw water quality sulfates in the river channel itself that were higher than the wild rice standard, for example, at least the existing wild rice standard. So I think the issue is we don't have enough information. I mean, these are samples that were collected on community recognizance. The money that it took to analyze the samples was fundraised, was crowdsourced. It gets expensive rather quickly to do any kind of reasonable assessment. So all we can say is this is a reason why monitoring is needed, because we don't know what's happening at these sites. We have limited information that suggests there could be risks, risk to aquatic life, risk to sensitive plants like wild rice. So I can't really speak to like what is the big picture, because we don't have that information, but we can say we looked to see what was out there. It seems like there's plenty of reason why additional investigation is needed, because there are potential risks that don't seem to have been addressed in permitting, that we don't understand. And until somebody is able to go and do really more extensive monitoring, we're not going to know what the risk is.
And I'd just like to say that I'm incredulous at the response that we get from the agencies and Enbridge about this, because they say, oh, we approved all of the drilling compounds, so we don't need to test for them. Really? That's what they told us. They said they approved of all the drilling compounds, so we don't need to test for them. Even if there's millions of gallons, even if they're bleeding out slowly over time, even if they have high pH or organic chemicals that break down with a biologic oxygen demand, or have sulfates in them, they just won't tell us. Yeah,
it's sort of a catch-22. So because their argument was, because we already approved these drilling fluids, we don't need to monitor for their impacts to the environment. And that doesn't seem like due diligence, because one, we don't know if they considered the volume of material that would be spilled. We don't know if they would consider how these materials might interact with the surrounding environment, how their chemistry might change, given what's out there already in the sediments, in the soils, what the chemistry, the pH of those soils are. So it's very unsatisfying. And the problem is, if you don't go out and monitor these things, then in the future, Enbridge is just able to say like, well, there's no impacts because no one ever looked for them. It's not a very sound approach to say like, we just assume there's no impacts, and the reason that we assume that is because we never looked. And that's basically what we have right now.
I think you may have just answered this particular question, but I'm asking it anyway, so you can have another quick short answer if that's appropriate. There is some evidence that easy mud drilling compound may be associated with toxic chemicals entering the groundwater. Is there any monitoring for this? I think you maybe just answered that, but I'm posing it to you again.
Right. No, there's none that we know of. And yeah, I think there were 17 different additives that Enbridge was permitted to use. At this point, we don't know which additives might have been used where. We do know about one of the additives that was used at the Mississippi River headwaters crossing. So right, it's we don't know, and there's no monitoring going forward. And MPCA has said straight out they're not going to monitor for impacts of spilled frac fluid.
And I think the answer to that at the agency may well have been different if the risks had actually been revealed. It's one thing to assume that you'll have tens of thousands of gallons of drilling mud and drilling fluids. And it might have been reasonable to have 500,000 gallons over the entire site at all the different crossings. but they came back and asked for a 10-fold increase to 5 billion gallons. We don't know, they won't tell us how much of that got mixed with mud for their buoyancy control or other drilling operations. We just have this gap between something that might not be a big concern because it's a low volume and the risk of the potential harm if it's a massive volume of materials. And it's in our groundwater regardless.
Someone is asking, 1 year of losing water from this aquifer, what kind of effects will that affect the aquifer long term?
I'm very concerned, and we don't have the data to know because they won't share with us the amount of water that's been released. We can't assess the volume. It ranges from 100,000 gallons a day to they've allowed permits of 2.4 million gallons a day. I think of water in large units, acre feet. For those types of flows to occur over so many days and months, I could envision an impact on the local resources and the fen, and especially during a drought year. But we simply don't know. It's one of the questions that we continue to ask.
We are nearing an hour here. I have a couple more questions. One is about what could be done at the federal level and the role of the EPA, particularly their process regarding emergency responses.
There's two things that I've thought of specifically related to this. The EPA has a process for actually permitting injection of non-hazardous material into the ground. It's called a Class 5 injection well permit. It's meant to assess those non-hazardous things and to measure their movement and fate. That is a permit I think that they should have required if they were going to lose so much mud. The second part is I think that the Corps of Engineers has demonstrated experience in assessing the reasons for these frackouts. I think we should ask the Corps of Engineers to prepare a report like they've done in other parts of the country to show the risk. If this is a historical event that has happened in other pipelines, it happened here expectedly, if you didn't believe the engineers report, we should have those kinds of forensic assessments of these, and that would be appropriate at a federal level. There's other things that are likely need to be done, and I think we just need to keep the pressure
in. I have two questions here, finally, and I hope I haven't lost track of other questions. Thank you to all the participants who've been asking them. What about MIRA, the Minnesota Environmental Rights Act? What about a MIRA lawsuit challenging the adequacy of regulations?
Yeah.
And I'll just throw out the last one because I know time is now closing for us. The other one is to Christy. Could you say a bit more about issues with open trenching? So maybe we could wrap these things up in a couple minutes, and then we'll thank you and everyone else.
I really think that we need to engage Minnesota's great environmental law community to look at that particular issue, to look at perhaps mandamus actions that force agencies to do their work, and look at the liabilities of these. There's a lot of places that we're revealing in this lack of information that I think we need good legal minds. I'll turn the other one over to Christy.
Yeah, I agree with that as well. Okay, so open trenching is the primary method that Enbridge used to lay the pipe in the ground. So they're digging a trench, you know, under the surface, and that was something that we actually intersected with another issue that came up during construction, which is this issue of dewatering. Because they are digging a trench across a wet landscape. There's a lot of groundwater very close to the surface. It's highly interconnected with wetlands and other surface water bodies. And so as they were trenching, they were encountering a lot of groundwater, which they then were pumping out of the trench. So that's a whole other situation because we didn't even talk about dewatering, but of course, something that happened was Enbridge ended up requesting a 10-fold increase in the amount of water that they were able to remove from the subsurface during a historic drought. So I think line 5 dewatering also needs to be like very front and center in terms of impacts, because that's also something that the agencies really downplayed. Is a whole other thing. We wrote a whole letter to the DNR about it. We had many scientists sign on with concern. There was violation of tribal sovereignty. Okay, there's a lot of issues with dewatering, but so yeah, open trenching. There are issues for stream crossings with open trenching. They basically dam the water back, dig a trench across the bottom of the stream, and then place the pipe, release the water. Because you are digging across sensitive stream banks, there are impacts of concern like destabilization of the stream banks that can lead to ongoing erosion. They are removing trees from the area along the stream bank, from that riparian area. That's a long-term impact that can't be rectified because the trees have to be, you can't have trees there for the life of the pipeline. And it's primarily that the trees and shrubs that are stabilizing the stream banks. So that has implications for the habitat at those locations. So there's definitely impacts in terms of risk of erosion, risk of destabilization of the stream bank, and impacts to aquatic life from that erosion and permanent removal of vegetation at the site.
I really want to thank everyone for joining this. Thank you particularly, of course, to our presenters, Jeff Broberg and Dr. Christy Dolph. Please feel free to stay in touch. I think we're going to be sending out some follow-up information with the recording link and also some resource materials. But if you're looking for those in a time-sensitive way, please reach out to Jeff. He's put his email in the chat, and we will put our contact information in the chat right now as we're closing. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.